Welcome back. Welcome to the folks who have joined us. My name is Nico Mealy. I'm on the faculty at the Shorenstein Center here. I'm actually teaching my first class of the semester as soon as we wrap this up at 1 o'clock. I thought the title of this part of the program is called "Your Next Big Startup Idea: Why Internet Policy Matters." And I think the goal here is to get into a little bit of a discussion about what it means for newer companies and startups, what internet policy ways it can constrain but also encourage newer companies entering the space. But before we do that, I thought right at the end of the last session, we had a pretty compelling comment from Alex Jones. And Alex had mentioned that he had two things. One was the San Francisco court's judgment on throwing the Yelp case out. But there was another story you wanted to mention.
And they're related, I think. Thank you, Nico. The other one was from China. The leading financial news organization of China has been charged by the Chinese government with extorting money from prospective advertisers or clients or businesses in order to prevent or publish certain stories. In other words, the idea is that they were extorting money and they were cooking their report. And that is illegal in China, and they were charged with that. Now, this is a funky kind of gray area for American journalism, because it's true that news organizations all over the country have long been seeking advertising from people they also cover. But you may not extort. You may not threaten. The issue for the web, it seems to me, is that there are laws that put limits on what news organizations can do in terms of their own reports. In terms, even in a First Amendment environment, there are things that you cannot do. The penalty for journalism for publishing something erroneous is libel. Defamation that does damage to people, that's something that the courts have said you can get, you can make a claim about. As I understand the web attitude about data and all of the information that they gather and what they put on their sites, there is an argument that is being made constantly, effectively, that they have First Amendment rights to do whatever they want. Now, in the case of the Yelp data, it was a matter of saying, we are not going to do this. We are not going to misuse this data, but that's something that basically they reserved the right to say, and there is no, as far as I know, no kind of law or case law that is going to put any constraints on that. However, if you're looking at Yelp and Google and other entities that are publishing, after a fashion, even though they just call it aggregating, information that potentially can do damage, then they are going to find themselves, I would think, in the realm of libel if they are going to claim First Amendment protections on the other hand. I think that the whole question really is, where is the control of this vast amount of data going to reside, and is it going to be considered a First Amendment issue, or is it going to be something that comes under a different kind of legal regulation? And I think that the web world will resist anything that puts any constraints on them aside from voluntary ones. I don't know whether that's going to stick.
So two questions there I would open up to the room. One is about the role of the First Amendment and some of the issues we're talking about around speech and regulation. Many of the companies and organizations we're talking about do operate essentially in the public sphere, and there are speech considerations. And I guess the second is also, you kind of added at the end there, some concern about resistance to regulation in the industry.
I don't know if that's the core problem. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be
Now,
interjecting.
I'm gonna actually just interrupt for a minute and say I have the not so enviable task of following Professor Zittrain there, And I'm going to follow to the same rules, which is ask people to keep themselves to one point and also to introduce yourself briefly at the beginning.
Yay, okay. No, Hiawatha Bray, right? I write about technology for the Boston Globe. This kind of, it seems to me that you're worried about First Amendment issues and legal issues, and I don't know if the problem even gets that far, because to me the most disturbing thing, and since I work in media, I'm aware of this all the time, in media, the classic way of expressing bias, it seems to me, is not lying about people or providing distorted information. It's about what you decide to cover and what you decide not to cover. And you could have a huge impact on businesses, on individuals, just based on whether or not you show something online or whether you don't show it. One of the things I worry about, for example, is that Facebook or Google or any number of online services could advantage or disadvantage certain groups, certain political parties, whatever, by simply choosing to show more of that perspective and less of something else. They could advantage a company by showing more data related to that company and less relating to somebody else. And I don't think you could do anything legally about it. And that's the kind of thing that I think is much more concerning.
Well, I take your point, but I think that the fact is that as the power of these websites is consolidated, as they grow, unlike the Boston Globe, if you don't like the way you're covered in the Boston Globe, you can go to the Herald, you can go somewhere else, you can go to the New York Times, you can simply go online. But if you're a business that is covered by Yelp and you are going to be impacted financially by where you lie in the advertising-driven Yelp rankings, and Yelp basically has the right to put you anywhere they want based on whether or not you buy advertising. That's not the way the Boston Globe does business, and there's really not a viable alternative to being on Yelp's list than Yelp. All I'm saying is that this is an area that I believe Yelp would. I mean, I don't know if the Yelp guys are still in the room, but I think that they would absolutely claim First Amendment rights, and they've been given them by the courts to put any list together that they want on any basis whatsoever. But it's also true that those lists now are, I think, clearly capable of doing significant financial damage to someone if they are not, in
And if you're
some
going to claim
respects.
First Amendment rights, there are other responsibilities and considerations that come with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I would disagree with that to an extent. One, if Yelp or any other site is not being responsive to the users and they're just arbitrarily having the rankings and it's no longer be useful and people aren't going to use it. Second, there are a lot of alternatives. You have TripAdvisor, and so the traffic will go to the sites that are most useful to the users, or even you'll do other searches. You'll look on Facebook and ask your friends. I mean, every time I'm on Facebook, someone says, "Oh, hey, I'm going to be in Boston. What's a great restaurant?" And that's not an official kind of ranking thing, but there are a lot of other ways. And if any site is not being responsive to the users or productive in that kind of forum, then people are going to use other sites, and there's lots of alternatives.
Well, libel law isn't geared to the question of whether somebody else is publishing something else. It's geared to what the individual publishes and whether it does damage, and those can be quantified and proven. I just say that if Yelp and others are claiming First Amendment protections, then that goes with the territory as well. And I really wonder how that's going to sort itself out.
Joel, just introduce yourself.
Yeah,
briefly.
Joel Kaplan from Facebook. So I've since we were referenced, I think I'm going to just violate the rule and make 2 points, but I'll try to make them quick. The first is, first of all, I grew up in Boston, love the Boston Globe. I just have to say, I find it sort of extraordinary, the notion that in the internet era, where the most important, I would say, and significant impact has been the small d democratization and the ability of individuals to have voice, the notion that in the town that I grew up in, where there was the Globe and the Herald, and if you didn't like the Globe and you didn't like their point of view, it was a good thing you had the Herald. Well, now on the internet, everybody has a voice, and they can have it on Facebook, they can have it on Yahoo, they can have it on any number of distribution mechanisms. And Facebook, at least in its algorithm, to Michael's point, and something we discussed in the earlier session, is trying to provide the information to the individual that is most useful and interesting to them. If we fail in that, then people will stop coming to Facebook and they'll stop using their news feed. And the second point I want to make that I think is most specifically relevant to the topic of this session of startups is this issue of liability protection for internet companies that are just showing user-generated content is probably the single most important protection that led to the proliferation of successful startups and the internet as we know it today in Section 230. So I think it's a great point, Alex, that you brought up to start the conversation. I think you can't overstate how important that intermediary liability is to the success of not just the companies around the table, but the ones that are just thinking of how they're going to reach their audience in the first place. If they're going to be subject to lawsuit for everything their millions of users put on their site, then those sites aren't going to be created and they're not going to succeed.
So I want to take that as an opportunity to shift our discussion a little to the sharing economy. In this session, we're joined by a number of folks, Chris Massey from Lyft, Molly Turner from Airbnb, Brian Worth from Uber. I was in Germany on Monday, and Monday night took an Uber home from my restaurant, woke up Tuesday morning to take an Uber to my first meeting, and discovered it was now illegal. Or I shouldn't say illegal, but not allowed to operate. Maybe, yeah, illegal. And looking at how that's played out in the United States, it seems like it's happening really on a basis of a municipality to municipality, that from different municipalities, different states, taking different approaches from a regulatory perspective. And I'm wondering about that in the context of should we have a broader, more uniform way of regulating some of the questions arising out of the sharing economy, or is there some advantage to more of a piecemeal municipal approach at this stage in the game? And I would note that this is an issue I think almost every company is facing around the table in some way, shape, or form, and certainly the public servants around the table are also dealing with this. Very interested in your thoughts as well.
Sure.
Just
yeah,
move
sure.
the mic a little closer.
Brian
Introduce
Worth
yourself.
with Uber. So a German court ruled that Uber didn't have the proper permits to operate in the country. We're appealing that process through the legal process and still operating in Germany. Since that court ruling, signups for Uber have gone up 590% in Germany. So, the upside to, open market, free markets is people vote with their wallet. And I think the German people are showing what they're interested in, and they're interested in having Uber and companies like that operate in their country. So we're hopeful there for a good resolution through the court system. I think as far as whether one solution or individualized solutions, I think it probably depends on the country, and I think it depends on what that solution is, right? We have jurisdictions we work very well with. We have good relationships with cities, or we have in some states, the state of Colorado passed peer-to-peer ride-sharing legislation to set up regulations, and it's a good regulation. It's something we work under, and other companies like Uber work under. So that's a good thing. And you have other states where it's tougher to get in there, and so I think it's just going to depend on the jurisdiction. I mean, one catch-all solution that doesn't work isn't any better than 50 different ones that you're haggling with. But I think my colleagues that run all over the country dealing with these in city by city would probably there's probably days where they wish there was one solution as opposed to 50 of them. But I think a lot of times local governments, these are, especially in our space, when it comes to this is something that local governments have traditionally dealt with. As far as the transportation market goes, and offering that kind of service, companies like Uber, I think we ought to work with those governments, try to come up with a workable solution.
Molly?
Sure. Hi, I'm Molly from Airbnb. I'd like to make a really important point when it comes to sharing economy and regulation. For the most part, not entirely, sharing economy companies are really dealing with regulations that have absolutely nothing to do with the internet. Airbnb, for example, all of the regulatory issues that we're working on around the world pretty much have to do with the issues, the laws that our hosts, the people who rent out their homes, have to comply with in their municipality, which have nothing to do with the internet. The internet simply enabled these hosts to do that activity, more people to do it more occasionally than ever before. And land use, in our case, is regulated at the local level, and there's really no way around that. And land use laws have very good reasons to exist. They protect safety, many other things that we as a platform rely on. Thank goodness Airbnb hosts live in homes that are safe for them to live in and safe for their guests to live in. So yeah, it makes it more complicated for us operating in 35,000 cities around the world to advocate on behalf of our hosts in those cities. But again, I would echo Uber's perspective that, we have to work collaboratively with these cities to figure it out, and hopefully we can come up with a couple solutions that might be applicable to thousands of cities around the world.
Does anybody else want to comment? Yeah?
Yeah, no, Chris Massey with Lyft. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think what we're finding is, as we have these patchwork of regulations across the country, and for us, and much like Uber, what we're dealing with are laws that were written far before anything like what we operate was even contemplated. So it's in some cases dating back into the 1800s in terms of livery. So what we provide to local governments is the opportunity to move into a new generation of innovation through their regulatory structure. So we come in, we work collaboratively with cities, with mayors, with states, state legislatures, governor's offices, and to some degree, at some point, I imagine congressional members are going to get involved in the conversation, but for the most part, this is a very localized issue. In order to help them understand how we can address mobility. And what I see, at least what Lyft has seen so far, is a desire to move towards what the next level of innovation regulation really looks like. So, we can then come to a city of Boston and say, okay, we want to be able to provide a positive peer-to-peer transportation mobility option for your citizens, but then we can also work with you to provide some data sets so you understand how people are moving around the city and really become a benefit to those cities as opposed to,
So offering some of the data collected for the purpose of public policy, for good policy making.
Yeah, I think that's where we're ultimately going to head, is we're going to have to partner with a lot of these cities. We're already doing it. We're already finding ways to work collaboratively with these cities. So that's just the next step.
Yasha, you want to count?
Sure. I mean, I guess just very briefly, it's very encouraging to hear these sharing economy companies around the table talking about the collaboration with local government. I work for the city of Boston, and we are trying to craft appropriate regulations that both address the public policy needs that we have, as well as ensure that these kinds of new and innovative services can deliver benefits to citizens. The challenge that I think we face is often that there are, we have to look at these problems not only from the question of here's a new service which is maybe being used initially by a small slice of a population that has certain self-regulating characteristics to it. When you think about a regulatory regime, that is going to apply not only to what exists today, but also to what comes after it, how these individual services evolve, what new services are created in the same space. And so there needs to be both an open-mindedness on the part of local governments, but also a measure of caution that says, what works for transportation company X may actually turn out to not be sufficiently protective of the public interest when it comes to transportation company Y that starts up next week. So I think that's the balance that we have, but we've certainly found that most of the companies in this space have been very open to working with us at the local level, and it's a dialogue that the city of Boston, at least, is very open to having.
Adam?
Adam Connor. I work at Brigade, which is a new civic engagement startup. But prior to that, I worked at Facebook. And I think particularly these examples of collaboration with government at the local level is encouraging, because in my experience, particularly having worked with the federal and some of the larger state governments, to take a step back, when startups or internet companies try and use this technology, when federal agencies, for instance, were first interested in using Facebook, collaboration is not necessarily the word I'd use there. It was, we want to use your free service, and here are the tremendous amount of things you have to do to let the government use your free service. They're going to cost you time. They're going to cost you lawyer money. You have to make changes. You have to do all these arbitrary things just solely to give the pleasure of the government to use your service for free. And it wasn't necessarily a collaboration, and there were really good people inside a lot of the structures, making one of them working really hard to push this forward. But I'd go to a meeting and 10 government lawyers would sit down and say, here are the 32 things you have to change in order for us to use your free service. And why won't you embrace the spirit of working with government and openness? There is a burden on startups as well for these kind of collaborations. So to see a little bit more of give and take, and so we'd come back and say, okay, is there any world in which you guys might think about changing your policies or talking about modernization of some of these rules? And oh no, we're not going to change anything on our end. And I think that What is nice about hearing about this local model is I think that hopefully, and I know again, many people in government are doing good work, but there needs to be responsiveness and a chance to modernize certain things as well. I think within government to allow some of these new technologies for agencies and others to use that. And I think that that's another part of the conversation, whether we're talking about Congress, whether we're talking about federal or state or others, is if we want the benefits of these new technologies, we need to also make sure the internal rules governing governance are being willing to be considered to modernize them, because it's an unfair burden that we were able to take on because at the time we were Facebook and we had the ability, even though we were much smaller, but a lot of other 1 or 2 person startups that government may benefit from using don't have that ability, and I think that that's a tremendous loss for everyone.
Yeah. Todd.
Sorry, George. Todd Cohen from eBay, and I appreciate what my colleagues from Uber and Airbnb and Lyft and their properly respectful attitude towards potential government regulation of their services and the need to collaborate at the local level, and I wholeheartedly endorse them to do that, but also with the reality that there are very entrenched economic interests that have every desire to put startups like that out of business, and they work actively and have political power and engage in many ways the worst type of regulatory models. We want to have a level playing field is the classic example of, well, then therefore we should have these unnecessary burdens placed upon new entrants that have nothing whatsoever to do with the service that's underlying that. And I'm pleased to see what the German people are responding and signing up at 592% increases, because it is actually what people want. And I would just make sure that as many of these companies, I advocate you try to get in early and inoculate yourself and try to make sure that you find the regulators that are not only captive, but that understand what's going on. Because what happens in the end is it's an example of fraternity hazing. We got hazed when we joined the fraternity. You're going to get hazed when you want to join the fraternity. So I appreciate that everyone's got the right attitude of we want to collaborate and work with governments, but let's be very clear. There are a lot of people that want to stop these services and will spend energy and effort and political power to harm these businesses.
So actually, that's a great point in the context of if we're talking in this panel about startups and why internet policy matters to startups, and we're thinking about every company in the room is frankly pretty young compared with some of the much more established industries you're frequently dealing with on policy and regulation. And there seems to me there's 2 challenges. One is a challenge of entrenched industries trying to protect their turf and from challenges frequently from unexpected quarters. Another might actually be just a generational gap among decision makers. On Monday, when I was in Germany, I was meeting with a group of very senior German officials who had no idea what Uber was, and they wanted me to show it to them on my phone. And this goes a little bit to Adam's comment about kind of the challenges faced inside of these institutions. And so I just wonder what are the right strategies, or what have some of the experiences been around dealing with government institutions that may have a generational gap in understanding some of these issues and experiencing them, coupled with some organizations, companies like Comcast, perhaps been in the industry in Washington D.C. decades long history for the industry there, and what kind of environment that creates for shaping public policy. Yeah.
Sure. Well, so I thought
Tell us your name.
Oh, sorry, Adam Kovakovich with Google. I thought Todd's comments were right on. If you're only playing what I would consider the inside game with policymakers, there's a good chance that newer companies and newer industries are going to lose, simply on the basis of older industries having been there longer, not just the taxi cab industry or the hotel industry, but the content industry, the telecommunications firms, right? These are companies that are many of whom are regulated. They've been They've been players before policymakers for a long time. I do think that one of the tools that is effective here and has been effective is showing policymakers when they are out of tune with consumers. The PIPA-SOPA battle that that Macon referenced earlier is sort of the quintessential example here. That issue was proceeding as an inside game debate, and it wasn't until it became an outside game with consumers weighing in that policymakers put the brakes on what they were doing. Unfortunately, I think that tactic is probably going to have to be used, but I will say that even in the wake of PIPA-SOPA, one of the things we've observed is policymakers, at least in the U.S., are extremely cautious about legislation becoming the next PIPA-SOPA. They don't want their bills to get PIPA-SOPA'd, right? They don't want to be the recipient of thousands of phone calls saying that they're on the wrong side of something. And so I do think there are going to need to be moments, I think as Todd referenced, where newer companies confront policymakers with saying, well, look, it's us who's on the side of consumers. And I think one of the scariest things a policymaker can encounter is that they are not on the side of their consumers, and they often switch sides very quickly to avoid that situation. Most long-serving policymakers are not going to last very long if they are completely in a sustained way out of touch with what their voters want.
If I could just add on to that, I'm trying to find it in my email, but it's not working. I seem to remember getting an email from Uber maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, about the challenges they were having in DC. And I thought that was just remarkable. They were, and I don't want to say if it didn't happen, I wanted to look it up, but I seem to remember this happening, that they were actually going to their customers to say, this is your community, we need you to be engaged on this. And then you look at this, what I think was a really terrific decision to hire David Plouffe. I mean, that's a tactic he's very familiar with. And so, to my earlier point, as companies start wanting to develop...
What do you mean that's a tactic he's familiar with? What tactic?
Grassroots organizing, using technology to play an outside game. And so as companies start engaging in these debates and realize that an inside strategy is maybe not sufficient and playing the outside game, it's just really mind-boggling to me the amount of power that these companies that have these large membership lists have when they decide something's important to their corporate interest. Now, they can call it their user interest, but it's a corporate interest, and they can leverage these lists to actually advocate for those interests. And I would say it's good or bad. It's just a new political dynamic.
Can I jump? I just like to add something really quick. I agree wholeheartedly with the importance of grassroots organizing and advocacy, but a unique challenge to startups regarding that is particularly ones that are far smaller than those of us at this table. They don't necessarily have enough people to do the grassroots advocacy on their behalf when it's just a nascent idea. In addition to the advocacy, I think education is also really important. And Airbnb has invested a lot in studying and sharing information about the impacts that this activity has to dispel a lot of the misinformation that's out there and really educate policymakers so that they're not relying on an anecdote from their nephew that used Airbnb 2 weeks ago, but really on data about who all of the citizens in their city, what they're doing. And again, that's a challenge for startups who maybe don't have the capability or even the scale to share that kind of information and data with policymakers so that they can make informed decisions.
I just wanted to jump on that point about sort of the power that companies have to mobilize their user bases, because I think it's actually more a way of keeping companies honest about what issues they take on and when and how they can mobilize their users, because our people aren't going to follow us unless they understand how the positions that we're taking have a direct impact on them. So for example, at Etsy, we've been doing a ton around net neutrality lately because our user community cares about it a lot, and they're worried that slowdowns of internet speeds are going to have a direct and negative impact on their small businesses. And so they're crafting pillows that say protect an open internet, and they're doing stuff like that, and that's what makes us, which is great, and also makes us feel very confident that when we mobilize our users next week actually to contact Congress about this, that they have our back and that we're not diverging from the interests of our community. And I think that's probably true for all the companies around the table.
Lorelei?
Thank you. The first sort of premise I think that's important to recognize in this whole conversation is that there's really no advertising model for democracy. There's not a way to sustain public purpose in a civic space with an advertising model. It's never been that way, and we have to figure out what is a sustainable business plan in civic engagement data in general. This is a big conversation that's starting to happen. The other thing is that our institutions have to be technologically self-determining to some extent. We have to give them capacity. And one of the ways we can do this is by giving places like Congress staff. Why don't we have Maker Fellows? Why don't we have a Code for America for the legislative branch where we reinvent land-grant knowledge for the public interest? What members of Congress very often don't have is basic situational awareness. The less they have this technological process competence, in my view, as a national security staff in Congress, the more complexity migrates to the military services. This is a classic explanation of what's happened with the NSA, is that when you give the technical competence and the sort of rewards of public service to the Defense Department in this case, a lot of responsibilities that are too hard for the civilians are just going to go there. And they've had the computer scientists and they've had the situational awareness tools for decades now. There are probably a couple hundred, Matt, do you know this? There are probably a couple hundred military fellows inside Congress. If you need foreign policy expertise, you ask for a military fellow. The State Department maybe has 24. The other problem inside Congress is it's working at 60% of 1979 levels of staff. Meanwhile, almost 50% of House staff has been moved into the district, so it's in the states. So unless we create some kind of a high-quality decision support system for our legislative branch in the states, it's not gonna appear, and it's gonna continue to look sort of like this proprietary information cartel, which is really what Congress looks like. And I say this with a great deal of love for this institution. I'm obsessed with it. But it really needs this kind of institutional empathy right now. It's not just, I'm so glad you're here, Nick, because the executive branch has been the focus of attention. But it's running into a wall right now when it comes to legislative branch capacity for even understanding these problems. When you're working on the Hill, you ask the person who's sitting next to you. It could be nuclear nonproliferation, and it could be technical IT questions. We have to somehow provide them people.
So someone else, Nick, do you want to jump in there about kind of
I think there's tremendous potential to bring entrepreneurs and innovators into government, and that's what we're doing with the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. That's what we're doing with the U.S. Digital Service, and so I think that's really important as we think about modernizing our government digital services. And the reason that's relevant to internet entrepreneurs and startups is government can be a platform, to kind of quote Tim O'Reilly. And we are opening up data as fuel for private sector innovation. And so that's one of many things that the Presidential Innovation Fellows work on.
I'd say one of the challenges for the public policy space, more broadly speaking, in the internet age, is that, what you've seen in the private sector is through startups, the disruption of old business models that can now be reinvented because of new technology. Well, in government, particularly the federal government, particularly something like an institution like Congress, you are not going to see that level of disruption at the same pace. And so it manifests itself, in my view, with things like 7% approval ratings. And those kinds of approval ratings that persist through a Pelosi majority and a Republican majority, different ideologies. So it's not an ideological rejection, it's a process rejection. And in my view, that's an extremely important issue for our country. And programs like PIF and others, 18F, serve as models. I think the United Kingdom has done really exciting work in how to modernize legislative activity. And I'd say the challenge, I think, for the broader technology community is at a certain point, it's like, how can you regulate Uber if you live your existence in a motorcade? So at a certain point, we need our legislative institutions and our executive leaders to be connected with the reality of life in our society. And I think it's a natural process. We've been through it before with the rise of television, with the rise of radio, and other things. And I think we'll get there. If I could pivot slightly to the startup sort of this issue of regulation. I think one of the things that's remarkable about the technology industry as a whole, at least right now, and through its existence in the last several decades, is that it is unique in the sense that it typically protects disruption of itself in a way that most other industries don't do. And as the technology begins to impact more and more sectors in our society, you see this regulatory response, not as a way of serving public interest necessarily, but as a weapon to protect the status quo. And I think it's the technology industry needs to keep the public on its side as sort of a primary objective, because without that, it will never be able to defeat those static interests. And so you think about things like self-driving cars, which are, I think, in my opinion, a net good for society on a variety of levels. But how's that going to impact the insurance industry? And how's that going to impact the transportation industry? And how's that going to impact the taxi industry and the trucking industry and all these other industries? And it's going to be a massive regulatory fight. And it's just one of dozens of examples that we can see, and as the companies around this room deal with on a daily basis. And I don't see the technology industry as being able to succeed in those fights unless they very cognitively protect the interests of their users so that they can leverage that in a modern, kind of corporate grassroots organizing, if you will.
Yasha, and then Hawa.
So I would just build on that and say, I think that there is tremendous opportunity for engaged partnership between the technology industry and the startup community and government itself. Chris alluded to this a little bit in talking about the ways in which, for example, a service like Lyft could share transportation data with with the cities in which they operate and perhaps help the city improve overall service delivery. We've done some experiments in Boston. I shouldn't say experiments. We've built some products in Boston. During this session, I got a notice that the broken glass I reported on the sidewalk by my house using our city app this morning had been cleaned up by our Public Works Department a few hours after I reported it. That's about changing people's expectations of government, not just picking up glass. It's about recognizing that people expect a standard that is defined in large part by what the technology industry has created. And so what I would ask as somebody in government to people who work in the technology industry is reach out to us and look for ways to partner with us, because we have service delivery, not only obligations, but we have a desire to up our game and to be able to match the kind of expectations that people have. And instead of thinking about it as, how do we avoid this regulation, or how do we get an opening to do this kind of service, if we think about where the mutual benefit lies, I think there are a lot of opportunities for everybody to come out of this, delivering a great product for their customers, whether they be citizens or paying customers on the other end of a product.
Hiawatha, Seth, and Juliet.
Oh, yeah, I was more of a question than statement. You can expect me to ask questions because I don't know anything. You hear lately a lot of people talking about a sort of a libertarian moment in politics. I don't know if it's true or not, but I wanted to ask if maybe the rise of internet startups wouldn't, to some extent, drive that. I mean, when you look at what's going on with Uber and Lyft and the sudden pressure it puts upon governments to reduce their regulation of the way they regulate transportation services, and I look at this and I think, are we going to have to go through this with every new internet-based idea that comes down the pike, where whole new areas of government regulation are going to have to be rethought? And won't that ultimately lead to a general push to increasingly deregulate sectors of the economy, to make it easier for small companies to start up, to make it easier for people to use the internet to disintermediate traditional industries? Are we going to start seeing political pressure to do that, or is it going to be an ad hoc, case-by-case basis? Some new company comes along and we'll have to rethink that one sector.
So I'm Seth Calvert from TripAdvisor. To answer your question, I think what you may see is consumer appetite, right, to have and a willingness to have more experimentation or more laissez-faire attitude about, I think what you're seeing with Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, Flipkey, which is a TripAdvisor company here in Boston, the bumping up, right, against old regulations that have existed for health, safety, and welfare, and we're supportive of those, right, against new technologies, what Molly talks about, being able to aggregate, and Brian talks about getting 500,000 people to sign up. I mean, that power and being able to do that has not existed, right, and up to now. And so that's an amazing opportunity for an entrepreneur to be able to kind of find a market demand that is pent up, right, by the populace. As that proliferates and people start doing it and adopting it, I think we've seen in many different instances, whether it's the companies that we named or, StubHub, with ticket regulations, all these things over the past 10 years, a little bit of a, hey, easy on the tiller, let's kind of see how this plays out, is one of the things that local government can do, because I do think there's a tremendous opportunity in the 35,000 municipalities that Airbnb is in, or wherever Lyft, and Uber are going to be, or Flipkey, to test and to learn and to understand. Part of what we do as a technology company is iterate, test, learn, iterate, and you have an amazing lab right around the world to be able to see what works, what doesn't work. And I think that can actually be applied also to the federal government and what you're talking about, Lorelei, with Congress. I think how Boston implements, technology and uses it and taking the best from what Boston can do, or New York City or Chicago, and then seeing what works. I don't know if it's going to happen on a top-down approach, but I think sort of a bottoms-up, test and learn, pick the best of the best is something that I think we could reasonably look forward to.
Juliet, and then Margaret, then Adam.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the questions that Matt raised around disruptive technologies, and in particular to think about technological unemployment. And just talk a little bit about the economic context in which all of this is happening. Partly because I think the sharing economy companies particularly, but tech companies in general as well, claim a lot of public good effects. And if we think about the massive employment destroying capabilities of these technologies, and that's the flip side of efficiency, is that they are really, that you got to own that part of disruptive as well. And then ask the question, what about technological unemployment? Something that came up yesterday in the evening discussion, and it really wasn't addressed well, I don't think. It's true that new jobs are created, but if you think about the whole, picture of economic analysis, and you look at the previous 2 centuries and how technological unemployment got absorbed, it was in 2 ways. Number 1 was growth, so you had very rapidly growing economies, and number 2, massive reductions in hours of work. We went from average hours of work being 3,000 hours of work in the late 19th century down to under 2,000. So neither of those, in the United States, neither of those conditions is really operative at the moment. We have slow growth. We are a mature economy. OECD just came out with a new report about all of the member economies. We are facing a future of low GDP growth rates over the next couple of decades, and we have big barriers to the reduction of hours in the United States. And I think we can't just assume that we're going to be able to absorb. And we really, if this sector wants to be able to not only sort of promote gains in the narrow, but also have the whole thing work out in a way that does yield public good, we've got to be thinking about those larger labor market policies.
Yeah. Can I?
That's, sure.
You mind hop in here, because I think this is, some of this is the way we want to look at a market in action. I think if you're looking at it as something finite, and we've maxed out what we're capable of doing as an economy or as a marketplace, then I think this is a bigger problem. It's not just a concern; it's a problem. But I think if you look at it as the pie is so much bigger than we realize. As an example, our Chicago team reported back that last year in 2013, they added 25,000 rides to the economy in Chicago. Not they took 25,000 from cabs, not we had 25,000 out of X amount. On top of what was already existent the year before, there were 25,000 more rides with Uber in the market, with Lyft in the market. That's the potential for that and the demand that's there for all of these services. And I think that gets to the answer Seth gave too, is the demand's always been out there for this stuff, but now we have the technology to actually meet that demand, and that changes the entire economic makeup. We're on the cusp of an economic sea change here in the way our economy works. This isn't, there's a time where there's a horse and buggy on the road next to a car, right? And people got around both ways. And I think the world's changing that way, and technology is allowing that change to happen. And I think these are valid concerns, but I think as that grows, the potential's there for the solutions to be there too. But if you stifle that growth just out of fear that we don't know what the answer to that is, then you're just stuck. I mean, you're literally stuck and never moving forward.
So we do have Janet Yellen, right, in trying to encourage the idea among economists and employers that increased wages are actually a good sign for economic growth. And I also think about the point Macon made about using your customers, mobilizing them to help affect policy change. But that can work both ways too. That can lead to the people who use platforms for income and employment to effectively unionize, maybe in a non-traditional sense, to demand increased wages or increased benefits. Yeah. I think we're Margaret.
I was going to make a point, sort of 3 points back. So if someone else wants to jump in, I'm happy to.
Well, I was just going to briefly say, I shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. There was a couple of years ago, story about, in fact, there have been lots of stories about the minimum wage and these people who are stuck in these jobs and the growing protests that they're launching, and you find yourself cheering and sympathizing. But of course, the very technologies that we're sitting around talking about are going to make it virtually impossible for these protests to pay off in the long run. I mean, you already have things like fast food restaurants moving to kiosks and tablets and things like that. And what you're going to end up seeing, I think, is, well, the problem of these wages remaining utterly stagnant for a large segment of the American population. And I think a lot of the technologies that we're talking about right here are indeed part of the problem, and nobody's quite figured out how to work around that yet. And I don't think there's an easy answer at all.
But they are the answer. That's the thing. Those technologies are the answer. That's kind of the point I was trying to make. I was in San Francisco, and I took a Uber X ride to where I was going, and the woman that picked me up, her husband came home from work. He had the car during the day. He came home from work, and she would go out during the rush hour, 2 hours while he was home with the kids. And she wasn't working full time as an Uber driver. In fact, she had the Lyft app on. When I got in, she turned her Lyft app on. And people do that a lot. They're using both, whichever one they can take. If the Lyft ride pops first, they take that. And but that's the opportunity it's creating. It's creating for someone to get around instead of saying, I ought to be making more money for working at the fast food restaurant. It's giving you an opportunity to supplement your lifestyle and your income in a way that's more convenient for you. And this is the opportunities here, right? This isn't something that's holding people back. It's something that's expanding opportunity.
It's an opportunity to work 3 jobs instead of 2, each of them paying
But it is offering a certain amount of flexibility, and it may mean that the workforce has to change and people's expectations of the workforce changes. So it may be that you have a small business that you're running on eBay or Etsy to make things or to sell things, while you're also producing articles that run on the Yahoo Developer Network, and you're doing multiple things that allows you to be interested. It also may allow you to be a stay-at-home mom with your kids and work out of your house. And I think there are certainly problems with the transition period from sort of everyone goes to work from 9 to 5 and has one job and stays there for 15 years to this sort of an economy. But I do think, I agree with Brian that there are, as there are certainly concerns and problems with it, there are also a lot of opportunities, and I don't think we know yet where all of those opportunities are going to arise. And I think generally the technology and the platforms that we all use create opportunities, and I think that's also the case in our sort of lobbying and policy setting, right? I mean, one of the things that's been really fun about working for Yahoo is that there's an opportunity to educate lawmakers about policy issues that they've never thought of, about technologies they've never used. And so yes, while you are oftentimes fighting an entrenched industry, you are also not set into any one policy answer. You could have 3 different policy answers that might work for the industry, and you get to sit down and sort of have that conversation with lawmakers. You get to sit down and talk to them about what are your concerns, what are our concerns, how do you make that work? And there isn't one necessarily right answer, but there's a huge opportunity to do a lot. And I think part of it is bringing the consumers along, bringing our users along, and making sure they're a part of that dialogue. And I think that's what you're starting to see in terms of effective advocacy by this industry.
So I think we have Juliet, David, and then Matthew.
I think we can't argue this on the basis of anecdote, and there is little doubt that these technologies have enormous labor displacing impacts. That's why people like them. That's the power of them. That's all the efficiency that's being claimed. And it's not to say that Uber won't create more rides, but I think there are really two big questions. Number one is, what is the aggregate rate of growth? Because that is absolutely central for how much of that displaced labor can be employed. And we can't forget that every additional percentage point of GDP growth puts a certain amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And it's a very close relationship. And we are coming close to the point where we're going to have those kinds of caps. And so that's a whole other new kind of constraint on this, thinking about what's going on at the level of the nation as a whole and the globe as a whole. And second is what's happening to hours of work, because if you don't have reductions in hours of work, you can't absorb technological unemployment. You just look throughout history. So it's not to say that we shouldn't have the new technologies or that we should somehow stop this. It's to say we got to think about their introduction in a bigger framework than just the local regulations around taxis. It's also about the income distribution and labor market policy, climate policy, and all of those things. We need to look at the big picture and to make sure that where are the gains going, to raise this point. And sort of, that may not just be the, up one particular internet company may not, want to get engaged in that, but the community as a whole has to. Precisely because of all those backlash issues.
So David, Matthew, and then Megan.
So I do think, David Simon, I'm with Salesforce, whose business is providing software as a service. I do think there's a valid point that when you have rapid technology change, you have rapid employment displacement. I think one of the places where this needs to be reevaluated very hard is in the educational front. This country has very much ignored STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, for most of a generation. And we have yet to really try to take advantage of the technology. You've seen a little bit of it with MOOCs, but in terms of STEM education for people who are being displaced so they can get new jobs in this new economy that are valuable, the idea of sending people out to community college, which, by the way, community colleges are very valuable. This is not a critique, but it's a relatively expensive way to re-educate somebody when you have the internet. And it creates all sorts of problems. How are they going to get their daycare taken care of when they have no income and they have to go someplace? So I think all these needs to be taken advantage of, and it kind of goes back to an earlier part of the problem, which is policymakers tend to get stuck in a certain way of thinking, whatever their perspective is. And you have this real dichotomy of the 20-somethings who are the people doing a lot of the work for the policymaker, but the policy decision maker is somebody who looks like me, who's typically very entrenched in a certain way of doing things because that's the way they've been doing things for 2 generations.
So Matt Heinemann, Shorenstein Center. In terms of policymakers, I think the single biggest thing that policymakers don't get is the difference in economics between a brand new niche and a niche that's even just 3 or 4 years old. Because what we've seen over and over again with the internet and in all kinds of new digital mediated spaces, that these spaces lock in pretty quickly. And that's especially doubly, triply true with sharing economy niches, which are essentially just market makers. We have 300 years plus of experience that market making niches become very quickly natural monopolies. And I think that should make us even more concerned about sort of this redistribution of market power. Because if I want to drive a car for a living, right, very soon, right, how many ride-sharing companies are going to survive? I would bet a month's salary, not 3, right? Probably not even 2, right? So I think that this very quickly becomes an issue where the economic concentration becomes self-sustaining, and where it's very difficult for individuals to bargain on their own with these entrenched firms.
Or even if 2 or 3 ride-sharing companies exist, there may be dozens of limo companies and taxi companies that they have replaced. So there's still a consolidation in the market, so to speak.
And by the time you're down to 2, as we've seen, for example, with traditional auction houses, it's very easy for them to collude. You don't have to, by the time you have just a handful of players, it's Sotheby's and Christie's, right? You don't even have to do an illegal conspiracy to make sure that you're offering the same sorts of deals to people who want to sell their artwork.
Althea, did you want?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to jump on the sort of point about educating the workforce and say that, I think that it's true that these technologies are both disrupting the labor market and creating new opportunities. We found that 42% of our sellers sold on Etsy for the first time, so that's about half of our folks who wouldn't have started businesses otherwise. But I think it's more than sort of the STEM education, which is important, but fills fewer jobs, I think, than sort of building out some of the work around entrepreneurship and preparing folks for this new and changing economy, which is not the result of technology alone. The economy has been changing for a long time towards more flexible work, self-employment, all of these things. And how do we help prepare sort of the workers that have been displaced for that new world of informal entrepreneurship, I think is a bigger question that doesn't fall just to the tech companies here, but to policymakers more broadly.
Oh, no, just had to say something about the STEM comment, because right down the street here, I think he's at Harvard Law, you've got Mr. Teitelbaum, who just came out with a book basically saying it doesn't exist, that in fact America has plenty of STEM-educated workers, and that these so-called panics about the shortage of STEM workers are a traditional cycle that have happened time and again throughout America, most famously during the 50s after Sputnik. And that in fact, if you look at employment rates and wage rates among people who actually have scientific technical training, it shows that there doesn't really seem to be a problem here because wages have been relatively stagnant even for them. So the idea that we can educate our way out of this by teaching everybody math is highly questionable. And we need to look at that too.
What's the relationship between the STEM education and some of the concerns in the tech industry about immigration? We're right here in a moment where the president is considering executive action on immigration if Congress doesn't act, although that seems to be politically charged. It may not happen. And we've had Forward.us trying to take a very active role to push some movement on the immigration front. Does anybody want to comment on immigration and the role that's taking in this?
A scam to keep wages low?
Joel?
Sure, yeah. So my CEO, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, has taken a very active role through Forward US in trying to push for comprehensive immigration reform over the last year plus. There's many components of comprehensive immigration reform. The ones that I think you're specifically focused on that relate to STEM have to do with what I think most of the companies who operate in this space do perceive as a shortfall of the types of highly skilled, trained engineers, computer scientists who can produce at the level that is required to remain globally competitive. I think most of the companies around here would be interested in reading the work of Professor Teitelbaum, but as a day-to-day matter, they know that they're not able to find from the U.S. trained workforce of U.S. born people a sufficient number of the skilled engineers they need to keep these companies growing and innovating and competing. So that's where immigration reform on the high skill side comes in. We have, at Facebook, we probably get about 50% a year of the H-1B, that's the temporary visas for high skilled workers, people that we've given job offers to, many of whom have been educated in U.S. universities but are foreign born. We get about 50% in the lottery, H-1B lottery, a year of people who we've given job offers to. Now, as a global company, if we can't bring those people to the United States to work with our engineers in California, we're probably still going to give them a job. we're just going to put it someplace else. And that's not good for the United States, and that's not good for our economy and for building and maintaining the kind of centers of excellence that we have in Silicon Valley and in Austin and other Boston and other places, and that we want to maintain. Just taking Facebook as an example, but I think this is true for a lot of the companies around the table. We've got close to 80% of our workforce in the United States and about 85% of our users outside the United States. That's the kind of structure that I think we want to maintain, right? We want U.S.-based companies growing jobs here and serving the world. So I think it's the prospects for comprehensive immigration reform are looking dim, I would say, in the current Congress. President is considering taking some executive action. We're hopeful that to the extent he does that, he tries to address all aspects of the problem, both the current undocumented situation and the shortage of high-skilled workers.
Yeah, I would argue just that this whole issue of immigration and what Facebook has been up to is makes the case for the tech community to get more invested in sort of long-term policy conversations. I mean, we have a humanitarian disaster on the border right now with a bunch of 7-year-olds coming, and it's part of a much bigger systemic problem where issues like governance and state failure are counterterrorism issues. It's getting wrapped up in that. DHS and the military all are calling this under the headline of resilience. You're going to see more and more definitions of resilience, and mass population movements are part of it. And unless this community, again, like takes on this whole civic problem solving of complex sorting and filtering of the challenges we're facing as a global society, I would argue, I think it's going to be hard to get out of this box. I mean, it can't just be about H-1B visas for your company. I was really surprised, honestly, as someone who's been working in D.C. for the last 14 years, is that the most noticeable thing about the forward.us was that one of the first things it did was take out ad buys on environmental issues against some of the members of Congress that you will desperately need as your strongest allies later on the immigration issue. And so like that stuff is all sort of relationship based. DC really is, it's kind of like a city that is a junior high. And you know, there's a high school. There's the jocks. There's the homecoming queens. There's the nerds. There's the geeks. I mean, there's just a moment right now. There's such a need for people to intentionally bring these problem-solving minded folks together and just figure out new ways to do this. And it's not going to look like these old models of lobbying. And I'll tell you what that looks like inside Congress is this tendency to use campaign technology for governing, and what it's doing is making governing look like campaigning. I think people who look at Congress can see this. It can't be petition sites, and it can't be like the correspondence management system of Congress. It sorts sentiment, not substance. So unless we figure out a way to privilege certain kinds of information that match institutional functions, like what is the subcommittee institutionally responsible for, that's the information that it needs at the right time for authentic, high reputation sources. I mean, so it's this kind of like my dream is that we're going to move toward a future where this community that has largely commercial interests in this space reserves or helps create some new rules. Because I feel like every single time it's these process rules that are just missing, and they really don't exist right now for civic social norms.
Joel and then Adam.
Yeah, I just just one response to what Lorley was saying. Look, I think, and Adam's a great person to talk about this because he at Facebook, 6 or 7 years ago started really pioneering the effort to educate members of Congress about how to use at least our platform to communicate with their constituents and to hear back from their constituents in new ways. Just one thing I want to point out though is while I think all of these observations about ways we can educate and change the institutions make a lot of sense. We also, as companies and as organizations, need to operate in the world in which we live today. And that's a big difference between Silicon Valley's approach to the world and Washington's approach to the world. Silicon Valley companies, they want to they see systems and they want to go around them or change them or disrupt them. Unfortunately, for at least for now, Congress still operates as a democratic body with members who go home to their districts. And while they may care a lot about what people in Silicon Valley think in Alabama, say, some congressional district, they care a lot more about what the members of their district think. And so as you think about how to get policy changes, and this is what Forward was struggling with, and I think made a valiant effort in trying to get comprehensive immigration reform done, you still have to change the minds of the people at home before their members of Congress are going to be responsive to them. And so what the strategy you mentioned of the ad, that was one ad as part of a broader effort and a strategy to figure out how to build the support in the districts to give members of Congress the fortitude to take what might be a popular vote in Silicon Valley, but a difficult vote in their home district. And it's this mix that we're still going to have to do for a while when it comes to politics. We're going to have to do some new stuff and try to change it, and we're also going to have to try to convince people in some old-fashioned ways, although maybe using new tools.
Just I think to talk a little about the points Lorelei made, which seem almost, and I mean disrespect, confused slightly, which is, first, I used to work in Congress, and, I love the institution. I think many of the things you suggested are good things. It also has to be an institution that wants to save itself. And that's not always evident in Congress. Yeah, their software doesn't work. They've signed these 10-year contracts. They don't break them. They cut staff, and they continue to cut staff. They don't always want to make the hard choices. It is incumbent on us to provide some help, but, you can't save somebody that doesn't want to be saved necessarily. That is a critical component. And when you talk about some of these more comprehensive solutions, I think certainly when I look around the table at the folks that represent policy shops in Washington, many of them have deep connections to Washington. That's, I wouldn't say they dropped in from junior high as a transfer student. But, when you look at some of these issues that you kind of say here, we need to be more involved in immigration and governance and security issues. Frankly, that's why we have governments. This is not that Google got into this job or Facebook got in the job to solve a refugee crisis in Latin America. If that becomes a thing they have to do now as part of a broader thing, I think they are certainly willing to play roles, as many companies are, but that's the role of government. And I think to kind of put solely the burden on us while trying to simultaneously save institutions we think are broken, there has to be willingness here. And I think the benefit is there are good people in government and in the chambers and in executive branches and at the local level who are doing this, but that's you kind of want both things here. We've got to save the institution that might not want to be saving and also replace it simultaneously and help make it better. It feels like a confusing argument.
I can't say that. I am definitely confused, but thank you. You bring up great points.
Nick and then Michael.
So I was just going to make the point that one of the innovations that a number of these companies represent is reputational networks. And there's a great example of that happening in the executive branch, where there's a recent article about how 10,000 federal executive branch employees are using GitHub. So GitHub is a platform to share code, but it's also a way to share ideas and have dialogue. And so you have 10,000 federal employees, from folks in the White House all the way down into regulatory agencies, who are collaborating, and you have these reputational mechanisms that are helping them kind of sort that kind of input from the public and from other federal agencies and so forth. On the how we make policy, yes, a lot does happen from Congress, but also a lot happens from regulatory agencies. And what I'm really excited to see is the modernization of regulatory agencies in the coming decade. And so just as one small example, the platforms that power a lot of the regulatory agencies are developing a open read-write API. So it's not that you just have to go to the website of that regulatory agency to put a comment in, but that advocacy platforms, grassroots, everyone can, on their own platforms, contribute, and that we can use technology to sort and weigh and all of those things in the rule-making process, which is a big part of kind of how we govern.
Michael?
Yeah, I'd like to add on the topic of immigration reform. That's certainly an area that affects our entire economy and probably every single industry in this country. And when you look at internet companies as a whole, they're all relatively new companies, young in their development, and certainly new to politics and policy. And I would argue that when it comes to immigration reform, our companies have done more, and certainly more than their share, to push this debate forward and have it be a constructive conversation and move the ball down the court to get reform done. And it's not something that happens in one Congress or 1 year. It's been many years since the last reform was in the 80s, I believe, last time there was comprehensive immigration reform. And I think internet companies deserve a lot of credit for not just picking up the mantle on what matters the most to their business interests. They've picked up the mantle on what's best for a broader reform and taken up a share for something that matters to the entire economy. Also on the, this general topic that we're talking about on this roundtable is why internet policy matters to startups, but also to companies that are still startups at heart. And there are a lot of issues, and as new entrants come in, policymakers have to make a decision. Are we going to be protectionist and try to protect industries that have been around? Like last night, Susan Crawford mentioned her father was manufacturing railroad ties, and then when the next generation of railroad ties came out, he had to figure out what to do. And part of the great thing about our economy and our country is we're coming up with new and better ways, and it's improving our society and our economy as a whole. And it's all growing, and we want to see that happen. I think the internet's a great catalyst for that. One other issue that we haven't raised yet, which is, I think, important to startups, but also established internet companies, is the issue of patent reform. We've seen a surge in entities known as patent trolls that have gone after the larger internet companies, but also it's become a barrier to startups where you're trying to create a business and instead you're having to deal with court cases, and that's something that policymakers need to look at also, and probably people have thoughts on that issue as well.
Thoughts? Well, I want to take a minute here because we have around the table people from industry, academics, public servants, and we have a moment here where we should really have a discussion about what is missing, what do we not know, what are some of the things Juliet had raised about giving broader context to the policy issues we're looking at. What are some, in your minds, each of you, what are some important areas for research, for discussion, to really dig in here as we look forward over the next couple of years? What are areas that really need a lot more attention so that we can make good policies, so that we can make good decisions?
Well, I think some of that has to start with education and engagement. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing internet companies come together and start groups like the Internet Association. I think it's why you're seeing the sharing economy companies come forward and really start to engage with government. But for government to make good policy and to be thoughtful about it and how these companies are gonna evolve in the future and to write policy that works in the long run, I think now is the time for a lot of engagement and a lot of education and a lot of conversations so that the groundwork is there for smart policy to be written versus sort of where I have seen we have been for the last few years, which is sort of reactionary policy that's not necessarily based on a real understanding of the industry or the issues or where the industry is evolving in the future. And so I think that's sort of a joint responsibility for both government and our industry to really start that and continue that conversation, that dialogue, and start building those bridges.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think from a local level, thinking about it, a lot of our challenge is to, we can articulate what our public policy goals are in regulation around, say, livery service or rental housing, things like that, but it's very hard for us to get good data about how effectively or ineffectively the systems that are being built by some of the more innovative companies in these spaces actually do or don't achieve those goals. And so consequently, a lot of the decision making gets done in the realm of anecdote about, I heard about this time when this thing happened. And so, while of course the companies in this space have a vested interest in releasing certain data that tells a particular story, I think it's an area for people who are interested in public policy research to look at, is to say, what is the overall impact of, say, a livery service alternative to the sharing-based livery service alternative to the transportation availability, to cost, to supply in areas that are undersupplied, things like that, to actually give us some hard data that we can look at to see how well these services do or don't support the policy objectives that we have.
I I think carbon accounting is a really important dimension of the data possibilities. And there are a lot of claims, particularly in the sharing economy, about the footprint lowering aspects of these activities. And, at the moment, we don't really know much about how true those claims are. I know Airbnb just did a study. So I think that we are going to be doing more and more carbon accounting in coming decades, and I think this is an area also where the whole industry could get out in front. I mean, in theory, it should be a happy story to tell, and also to be a model for the kind of putting these accounting systems into place and being kind of proactive about it, I think would be really fantastic.
It's interesting. I've never encountered a politician who is anti-innovation, and very few are anti-internet. And yet, innovation, as we know, has effects, has consequences. I mean, we've talked about a lot of them. It can be disruptive. It can cause shifts in the workforce. And the difficulty that a lot of us who are engaged in public policy are engaged in is that oftentimes there is a quick reaction from policymakers. Oh, we were for innovation until we started seeing these disruptive effects, so now we need to put the brakes on that. And I think that these are all valid questions. Look, I mean, we have a structure of labor laws, of child safety laws, of privacy laws, not just in this country and elsewhere. And though we might not agree on the structure, on the specifics of those laws generally reflect a past consensus that those things are important to us, right? Now, the format that those laws take in the future may be very different from the way they've taken in the past. I'm not sure that, protecting a taxi medallion system is the best way to ensure that we have a vibrant middle class, right? I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that one possibility is to let some of these things play out. I'm struck by the fact that a couple years ago, Walmart faced a lot of criticism for, just basically having a lot of, sort of lower paid workers. And in part because of pressure they were facing, they voluntarily acted to give, more robust health benefits to a lot of their employees. I don't know what went into that calculation, but I think they're probably thinking, look, we are a large employer of middle class people. We think this is the responsible thing to do. And I think that as some of these internet businesses become more mature, I think companies are going to grapple with a lot of those effects as well. So, I sort of feel like with respect to policy, there can be a do no harm approach from regulators, not acting too quickly, but letting some of these things play out. And I think some of the old values that informed older laws will just, will manifest themselves in sort of new ways, maybe more modern ways.
Yeah, I just sitting here listening to everyone, I was really struck. I think Molly started off by saying a lot of these debates are not about the internet, they're about many other aspects of what's happening on the ground, and it's true. We spent most of this session talking about things that have nothing to do with patent trolls or net neutrality or any of these technical issues that people hear and say, oh, let's let the nerds talk about that. I think what's happening is you're seeing technology-powered companies changing society more rapidly than our institutions that govern society can keep up with. I mean, I know that because I've been first row seat of that whole thing, and so I walk away, a little, concerned about how we're actually going to fix these institutions. I think at the local level, you see people like Yasha going in, and there's a number of folks around doing this. That makes me really, really optimistic. But when we look at Congress, I don't know the path for that. I mean, I applaud Lorelei working on this, but I don't think you figured it out either. And so one thing that I would really ask all of you to keep in mind is we definitely in DC feel an attitude at times of, well, government's broken, let's just avoid them. But just ask yourself, to the earlier moderator's point, where are we going to be in 2030 if you keep that attitude? And what are the choices you can make that are going to help improve our institutions, because you're forcing a lot of changes in society that have impacts far beyond who gets a taxi. It's who's driving that taxi, and do they have health care, and what happens to all these people that are out of work. the environment, all of these things, and our institutions can't keep up with that rate of change. It's a real positive note to end on.
So before we wrap up, and I know people have some flights to catch, but we did have some people at the table who haven't had a chance to talk. So I just wanted to open up, maybe, I don't know if Chris or Kerry or who else hasn't had a chance. Down on this end, you want to add anything to the discussion before we wrap up?
Hi, I'm Kari Jorgensen. I'm from TripAdvisor, the lawyer who is in charge of vacation rentals, assessed at Flipkey, FLIPKEY.com. Check it out. So I just on a more optimistic note, following on what Macon, is that how you pronounce your names, said, is that there are some of these companies that are disruptive companies that are starting to take care of their, they're not technically employees, but I guess contractor. I mean, TaskRabbit, I think, set a minimum wage of $11.20 an hour, and they're trying to treat their taskers well by directing them to and getting good deals on health insurance and cell phones and so on, and tools that they might use in their tasks. And I think, with companies that are sort of working through this, and I know Uber has sort of faced protests in Seattle recently by their drivers because they didn't think that their pay is high enough. I mean, I think that there will be, I'm optimistic that there will be a good outcome. I mean, I won't want to get into an Uber if I feel like the Uber driver is losing money on this ride and is really unhappy. My Uber driver this morning, first thing she said to me, I asked how she was, she said, "We're alive. It's wonderful." But anyway.
Good job, Brian.
You're welcome.
I think that the companies need to, I mean, Flipkey and the vacation rental businesses aren't really dealing with labor so much. It's really, renting out properties. So this isn't really directly impacting the business. What's that?
We appreciate you bringing it up, though.
Yeah. No, but I think that there will be every Uber driver I've had has been, I think, genuinely happy. I always have asked. I worked at Zipcar before, so I'm interested in mobility and their happiness. So I think I'm optimistic that these new companies will be able to find an outcome that's good for workers, good for consumers, good for the economy. So,
Leonard or Matthew, Chris?
Yeah, my name's Matthew Guidarelli. I'm with the Harvard Innovation Lab. This has been a great discussion, listening to all of your points. I want to just make a comment on, it's kind of combining both Seth and David's points. Seth, I think you talked about infrastructure within the government, and David, the dichotomy between those making the decisions and the people, the consumer, the user's needs. To me, what I see as a pattern here is how can we decrease the social distance between the decision makers and those where those policies impact? You look at the city of San Francisco has introduced a platform similar to Open IDEO, where they crowdsource people living in the city to help solve problems and decide what to use, either repurpose land or the rest. New York is growing in their participatory budgeting. And so I see great opportunity for tech companies to help these decision makers decrease that social distance so that it has a more salubrious impact on society.
Chris?
Sure. Sorry, my name is Chris from Reddit. I'm really interested in kind of what Lacan had said is just the disconnect between Congress and these companies and how quickly we're moving and users expecting things instantly. I think Adam had said that you used to have to go look into the basement of the municipal building for a record, but now you can get it immediately. So in 2030, what are people expecting of Congress in the time it takes to make decisions? So that's something that I'm really interested in, and I'd like to see. I don't know the answer either, but I think with the instant gratification that we all have, and Uber, there was a mistake, and within 20 minutes they refunded my money. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how can Congress adapt to making that change?
So it's just a few things that I've learned kind of working in the space for a few years that I was often confused by. There's a big difference between policy deliberation and delivery of citizen services. And when people think about technology and government, they kind of lump them all together. And so when you look at, Yasha being able to see glass on the sidewalk, take a picture, and it gets fixed, that speaks, I think, exactly to this growing expectation that people should be able to do anything, anywhere, at any time. Having a deliberative body that is that rapid is probably a bad idea. Now, it would be different because we'd be making choices and doing things, which is, perhaps preferable to the current situation, but you need better deliberation. This does bring up, I think, one of the scariest things about the internet on policy to me, and I'll just make it and be done, is this notion that you have a lot of companies that deliver information to users based on what they think their users want. And as we see it develop year over year, you start to see things like the filter bubble and all of these other behaviors where people are connecting with people who share their worldview. And you're seeing a similar thing happen in politics as people race to more extreme positions, literally move to new geographies. And I think it's affecting our political debate. And I wonder how we stop that. Because if the model for an internet company is we want to deliver what our users want, and we try to make our robots work to deliver that information instantly, well, that doesn't actually force them to think differently about stuff. It actually just reinforces their worldviews.
Totally, yeah.
And I don't know how that stops, but it really reminds me that what's best for our users isn't necessarily what's best for our citizens, and we've got to make sure that we're cognizant of that.
Leonard? Sure. Leonard Carden from Monster.com. Just want to circle back to the startups and what they should be thinking about. If they're entering a regulated industry, they have to keep in mind, going back to my days as a civil servant, the risk-reward ratio for a civil servant is entirely different than it is for an entrepreneur. And so, the first time that there is a fatal accident due to a ride-sharing service, everybody's going to look to that government official that let that service operate. And the risk is extreme, but there's no reward. Whereas you're starting up that service, your reward is potential millions or billion-dollar enterprise. You've got a lot of motivation to get there quickly and get it done quickly. Whereas the civil servant is going to be thinking, do no harm, don't take the risk, do no harm until I'm certain it'll all work out. So you just need to keep that in mind. And there's really no good way around that except the cooperative efforts that we've heard about and educating the government officials about why your service will not do any harm. And I think I'm very encouraged by what people said before about the collaborative efforts that are occurring. But I think sometimes the entrepreneurs go charging into the room and don't realize the person they're meeting with, the government official, they're not just protecting vested interests. They're also, they are risk avoidance for a reason, partly because there's so little reward for them, and partly because they're thinking do no harm.
Well, this is a really stimulating, interesting discussion, covered a very wide range of ground, beginning with our initial discussion of use of the First Amendment around data online, ending with some of the, in between, talking about some of the challenges facing both governments and startups in navigating unfamiliar terrain, the challenges of these institutions, all in the midst of different kinds of change. And I think maybe on that note, I will let our co-host Michael give us some closing thoughts.
Yeah, so just wanted to first thank Maggie Williams and the Harvard IOP and the Harvard IOP staff for making this symposium happen. I think it was a very productive conversation, and wanted to thank our moderators. Nico, thank you so much for taking the time, and all of our participants. These are important issues, and as the policy landscape changes and companies evolve, probably next year, if we have the same conversation, there'll be new companies and new topics that we'll talk about, and that's exciting. And I think this this conversation helps move the ball forward on all these important issues. So thank you all very much.
Kathy?
Yeah, and I just, on behalf of the Institute of Politics, want to thank Michael Beckerman and Tom Manitos, who came to us with this idea of pulling everybody together. thank all of you for participating. If there's anything we can do here for you, that would be great. And I want to especially thank Christian Flynn, who's down in the corner there, who did all the logistics and making this happen and pulling you all together, and along with Tom Manitos and Eston Perez. So thank you so much for joining us. And again, we're here and we're happy. We're always looking at new and innovative things to do at the Institute. So if you have any ideas or ways that we can be helpful to you, feel free to join us and call us. Thank you.